Hi, I'm Drew, and I'm an amateur model builder. I'm building a layout in my basement called the White River Line, inspired by the Frisco Railroad in the Ozarks. So I'm back over here at the layout, getting ready to do some more track work. And what I've got to do at this point is basically just lay out a bunch of tangent track here on the rail yard. And if I'm honest, it's not terribly interesting to do. It's pretty repetitive. And I imagine for you guys, it's not terribly interesting to watch either. Now, I'm not an expert on hand laying track. What you've seen me do here on my videos is all the hand laying of track that I've ever done. Well, it's all the track laying of any kind that I've ever done. So, not an expert at all. But what I thought I would do is step you through the process that I do in a little bit more detail than I provided in some of my other videos, and talk about some of the things that I've learned along the way so far on hand laying track. Now, I also want to remind you about my 2K giveaway, where I'm giving away a couple of hoppers from Bowser. I finished up constructing one of them, and stick around for the end of the video for me to talk more about that. So, let's jump into it. Before digging in, let's review some of the tools and supplies I use. My primary tool is a pair of needle nose pliers. These are a smaller pair I picked up from the hardware store. You can buy specialty pliers from online vendors, but I'm cheap, and these have worked well for me. Track cutters. These are Xuron, which seem to be the most popular brand. This particular pair are vertical cutters. I've actually gotten a few comments from folks online that I'm using my cutters wrong. The typical track cutters are designed to cut horizontally, so when people see me cutting my rail vertically, they're thrown off a bit. The only reason I have the vertical cutters rather than the horizontal is that the store I bought them from was all out of the horizontal ones. So I got these instead. A bastard file. Nothing fancy here. I just picked it up at the hardware store. And another small file I stole from my stash of files I use for model building. It's helpful to use these to refine the filing I've done with the bastard file. A straight edge. I use this to help keep the tangent track straight. T-pins. These come in useful for marking ties and holding down rail or switches. Track gauges. I've got a couple of Micro Engineering 3-point gauges and an NMRA gauge. I use the 3-point gauges to hold the rail in place, and the NMRA gauge mostly to double check my work. This homemade track centering jig. I use this so that the rails will be in the proper position to keep the track centered on the ties. Another homemade jig for gapping rail joiners, so they slip on the rail a little bit easier. I also like to keep a fine point Sharpie on hand to mark rails for cutting. The rail I'm using is Micro Engineering Unweathered Silver Nickel Code 83. I'm using the same size on the whole layout. I didn't feel like messing around with different sizes. I keep a small supply of rail joiners on hand, also Micro Engineering Code 83. Finally, Micro Engineering small spikes. I go through these pretty quickly. I've probably used close to 2,000 already. Before doing any spiking, I prep the rail, starting with cleaning it. I just use a bit of paper towel to wipe off the oil that is used in manufacturing and any dirt or dust that might have accumulated on it. Next, I inspect the ends of the rails to make sure they are plumb and square, which they generally are with an uncut piece. If there are any burrs, I file them off, and I lightly file the base of the rail on the bottom and the corner so that the rail joiners slip on a little easier. Let me quickly review the anatomy of a piece of track. The bottom horizontal bit is called the base. Pretty straightforward. The top horizontal bit is called the head. This middle vertical bit is called the web. Once I have the ends of the rails dressed, I use my jig to gap a joiner. I push one end on the jig, slip it off, turn the joiner around, and push the other end on. and I slip it off again. Then I can pretty easily put it on the piece of rail I'm installing. Putting the rail joiners on the rail before I spike it down is a lot easier than putting them on afterward. Next, I slip the rail onto the joiner that I placed on the adjacent rail when I installed it. Then I spike down the new rail here at the beginning. I'll dig deeper into the details on spiking the rail in a few minutes. I always work from the back of the layout to the front. It just makes it easier. My goal when spiking down the first rail is smooth, clean lines. I take a different approach to curve track than I do with tangent track. With tangent track, after spiking down the beginning, I spike down the end using my track centering jig to help position the rail. Then, using the T-pins, I mark the 11th tie past the joiner at the beginning of the rail, and every 8th rail after that. I mark out this spacing so that when I spike the rail, I have one less thing to think about. I want my focus to be on keeping the rail straight, and counting ties to keep my spacing correct can be a distraction. So, counting my ties beforehand keeps my attention where I want it. I mark the 11th tie at the beginning because I'm going to spike the rail at the first 3 ties for a little more security at this critical spot. With the ties marked, I grab my straight edge. Well, it's just a metal yardstick I got at the hardware store. And I line it up at the beginning and the end of the rail. I line it up at the head rather than at the base. The base has spikes sticking out, so this would throw off my accuracy. I spike the rail in the middle. Then I spike halfway between the beginning and the middle, or, a quarter of the way. Then I spike halfway between the middle and the end, so 3/4 of the way. Then I keep dividing the sections in half until I've spiked every 8th rail. This method keeps the rail straighter for me. I find that if I move from the beginning to the end, things can start to wander a bit, and it's hard to bring them back in line. Once every 8th rail is spiked, I go back to the beginning and spike those first 3 ties past the joiner. Then I spike every 4th rail. Although the rail is generally stable enough that I don't need to use my straight edge at this point, it can move a bit. So I continually sight the rail and make adjustments as needed. I need to add a bit more rail here, so I mark, clip, and file the correct length of rail. There is a right and a wrong direction to clip these rails. The track cutter cuts flush on one side, and in a V shape on the other. It takes a bit more work to dress the end of the rails I cut than the factory edges. I apply the same steps with this piece of rail as I did the first. When I go back to the beginning of the rail, I add the extra spike at the end of the last rail. Now I don't have any curved rail to lay down at the moment, so let's look at some track I had laid down in previous videos. For curved track, I start in the same way as I do with tangent track, by spiking down the rail at the beginning. However, I don't spike it down at the end. Instead, I use a couple of T-pins to hold it approximately in the proper place. Then, I use some more T-pins to again approximate the curve the track will follow. I mark the ties just like I do with tangent track. In contrast to tangent track, I start at the beginning and spike every 8th rail rather than using that half method. And I use my centering jig the whole way. I frequently sight the curve of the rail as well as run my hand along it to ensure that I have a smooth, even curve. One further difference between curves and tangent is that I solder the joints on the curved rails, but I don't on straight. The soldering on the curved rails helps keep the line of the curve smoother, but this isn't needed on tangent track, and the unsoldered joints allow for some expansion and contraction if it is needed. Now, onto the second rail. At the suggestion of a couple more experienced model railroaders, I've started offsetting the joints on my track to make for more reliable operation, so my track will only need to cope with one joint at a time. So I start my second rail with a smaller piece. I slip it into the rail joiner and grab my gauges, and I spike it on the first 3 ties. Then I work from the beginning to the end, spiking every 4th tie. I offset these spikes from the spikes on their partner. Now might be a good time to get into some more detail on the steps for driving these spikes. I grab the head of the spike with the tip of the pliers. If I'm spiking on the far side of the rail, I place the head pointing towards the inside of the plier. If I'm spiking the near side, the head will point towards the outside of the pliers. I try to get my body in the most stable, comfortable position possible, and I rest my hand on the work surface to give myself more stability and leverage. I place the tip of the spike on the tie, and I adjust the angle of the spike in the pliers if needed. I try to go in at about a 75-degree angle to try and lock the rail in place. Too low of an angle causes the spikes to run into each other and increases the likelihood of splitting the ties. With my first push, I'm trying to get the tip of the spike through the tie into the roadbed. Then I adjust my grip on the spike. If I'm working on the near side, I keep the pliers horizontal and grab the head so it is near the bottom of the tip of the pliers and push it down a little further. Then I use the tip of the pliers while they're closed, and I drive the spike the rest of the way down. If I'm working on the far side, I work vertically with the pliers, using basically the same method. Whereas when working with the first rail, my goal is smooth lines. My goal with the second rail is to stay in gauge. The 3-point track gauges, while not a necessity, make this process a whole lot easier than just using the NMRA gauge. However, they're not foolproof. I typically place one gauge further down the line from where I'm working to keep the rail relatively stable. If I'm working on a curved section of track, I'll use some T-pins to keep the end of the rail stable too. For the working gauge, I place it so that the side with the 2 legs straddle the tie I'm working on. I drive the spike on the near side first, using my left hand to hold down the gauge. This really helps to keep the rail firmly in place and thus engage. Then I run the gauge along the rail. If the gauge gets bound up or doesn't move smoothly, I know I'm slightly out of gauge. Then I grab my NMRA gauge to double check the distance. The track portion of the NMRA gauge has 2 little tabs on it. This little portion here, next to the tab on the right, and before that little shelf, is the tolerance for the distance between the rails. If the tabs don't fit between the rails, the space is too narrow. If it's wider than that notch, it's too wide. If the gauge is too narrow, I can twist the head of the spike to widen it. If the gauge is too wide, well, I need to be a little bit more careful with the placement of my second spike in order to narrow that gap. Now I'm ready to drive the spike on the far side of the rail. If I'm in gauge, it's a matter of driving it like I described before. If my gauge is too wide, I'll flip around my 3-point gauge so the single leg is on the near rail. I hold it down tight while I'm driving the spike. I double check my gauge after driving the second spike, again by sliding the 3-point gauge along the rails. Most of the time I get into a flow and the process moves pretty quickly. It can be a bit tedious, but also meditative. now that I'm getting this rail yard down, I've got a little more track work to do before I start on wiring. I got a couple more switches to build for the engine service area, and I need to add the switching lead. Hopefully, this has been helpful for those of you interested in hand laying your own track. If you're experienced with hand laying track and you got tips of your own, leave a comment below. I'd love to read them. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook. Those links are in the description, along with a list of tools, supplies, and resources I use. Please leave me a like if you've enjoyed this episode. It is the easiest way you can support my work, along with subscribing. If you'd like to support me further, check out my Amazon wishlist in the description, or visit my shop and buy yourself some White River Line merch. I still have my giveaway going on, so if you'd like to win one of these Bowser covered hoppers, just leave a comment. I'll pick 2 winners at random, and for the first prize, I'll paint, decorate, and weather the car for you. For second place, well, I'll leave the finishing up to you. Thanks for joining me, and please join me again next time as I continue modeling the White River Line.